Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. Andy, could you take us to the first slide?
Yes.
Well, welcome to our Powering Forward series. This is the second installment in our series, which is produced collaboratively between the Business Council for Sustainable Energy and Clean Energy Business Network. And this series is examining the unique impact facing clean energy industries during the COVID-19 pandemic and the vital role our sectors will play in the economy's recovery. Each episode is produced collaboratively with partners working to advance clean energy, demonstrating that together we can power forward through this crisis to emerge as a stronger, more resilient America. And we are delighted today to partner with environmental entrepreneurs on today's episode. A few quick housekeeping notes. I want to let you know that we are recording today's episode and we will be distributing the recording and slides as soon as they are available. Also, please be diligent in keeping your lines muted. We have a lot of participants and we would like to avoid background noise. And we're delighted that we have more than 500 people registered for today's call, and that is why we have opened up the YouTube room as an overflow should folks be unable to log into this presentation. I also just wanted to note that if you do at some point drop off the call and are unable to log back in, please review the email reminder that was sent today, which will provide the YouTube overflow information. So our agenda for today is we're going to be starting with brief welcome remarks from Lisa Jacobson, the President of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy, myself, Lynn Abramson, the President of the Clean Energy Business Network, Bob Keefe, who is Executive Director of Environmental Entrepreneurs. And then we're going to talk a bit about a decade of growth in the clean energy economy with Ethan Zindler from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. We're then going to transition into the first quarter of 2020 and the disruptions we have seen to the industry there, with further comments on that from Ethan. And also we will hear about the disruption to clean energy employment from Bob Keefe at Environmental Entrepreneurs and Phil Jordan at BW Research. And then finally, we'll conclude with an outlook on the clean energy future with some further insights from Phil and Bob. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to Lisa to give us a brief introduction about the Business Council for Sustainable Energy.
Thank you so much, Lynn. And it's a pleasure for the Business Council for Sustainable Energy to partner with Clean Energy Business Network and E2 on this really well-timed discussion. The Business Council for Sustainable Energy is a coalition of companies and trade associations in the energy sector. We are brought together with a mission focused on expanding clean energy markets and the utilization of clean energy technologies, products, and resources. And we've focused mostly on the areas of commercially available clean energy technologies in the sectors of energy efficiency, natural gas, and renewable energy. This particular program is important to us because it gives us an opportunity as a coalition to consider the trends that we've seen over the past decade that are quite substantial in terms of the clean energy transformation, and look at it from several aspects, from energy affordability, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, and sustainability. And I think very importantly, a private sector perspective, because we have seen the last decade being transformed by people and by businesses in terms of energy management and the choices that they're making about energy services and resources. So it's a very exciting time for the energy sector, but at the same time, we are now in this urgent health crisis, and it is providing new opportunities as well as challenges as we go forward with regard to energy. So I'm very much looking forward to the conversation and appreciate both the partners in this effort with BCSE. You can go to the next slide, please. Our membership is very broad, as I said. We have pretty much all areas of the energy value chain included, and you can go to the next slide, please. And we are very pleased that in the last several years, we've been able to partner with Clean Energy Business Network as an independent entity of the BCSE. And I'll turn it back over to Lynn to talk a little bit about CEBN.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lisa. The Clean Energy Business Network, as Lisa mentioned, is an independent small business initiative of the Business Council for Sustainable Energy. And we were initially founded by the Pew Charitable Trust 11 years ago and spun out of Pew to become an organization in our own right with the BCSE family 3 years ago. We just celebrated our third birthday on May 1st. We serve as the small business voice for the clean energy economy, working to enhance opportunities for clean energy technology and service providers in 3 mission areas. The first is policy support, working to inform and engage small businesses in policy issues impacting their industry. Also, market and technology education, both internally facing within the industry and externally facing towards customers, decision makers, and stakeholders. And finally, in business development assistance, mainly in the form of industry collaboration and aggregating useful information and opportunities for greater exposure. So next slide, please. We have a community of 4,200 business leaders across all 50 U.S. states, representing very diverse technologies, from renewable energy, energy efficiency, natural gas, storage, grid technologies, carbon sequestration, and more. And we welcome folks on the line who are interested in learning more to visit us at cebn.org and learn more about how you can become a part of our community. We have premium business development resources available starting at only $250 per year that can help put your business on the map. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to turn it back to Lisa for a moment to talk a little bit about the BCSE Resilience and Reliability Dialogue.
Thank you, Lynn. Starting 3 years ago, the Business Council for Sustainable Energy's Board of Directors launched a Resilience and Reliability Dialogue. We did this in part because of the very devastating impacts of wildfires, hurricanes, and other events, including cyber threats that we were seeing throughout the sector, and realized that we needed to have a more focused initiative under the BCSE membership to consider the implications and opportunities to enhance resilience and reliability. We started with a very robust project with a number of partners called Readiness for Resilience, and it worked directly with communities in Texas and Puerto Rico after the 2017 hurricanes. We focused on bringing the private sector in and looking for opportunities to offer new technologies and bring really the digitalization wave to communities that were looking to rebuild after these storms. They were also looking at ways to utilize their community assets and buildings in new ways. And I think for the COVID pandemic, those questions arise, and perhaps the movement to think about flexible buildings and digital tools will accelerate. As part of our effort, we started for 25 key leaders in the field of resilience and reliability and asked them, how the energy sector could play a role. And this Powering Forward webinar series is an excellent follow-up to that. And again, I think it's happening at a really important time. And resilience and reliability are not just things that relate to natural disasters. They also, of course, we need to prepare for future events and health crises that we're in right now. So one of the things that we did as part of our Readiness for Resilience project is share with local communities case studies of how integrated technology portfolios could help them with the questions that they were trying to answer in terms of how to rebuild better. So I encourage you to take a look at some of those case studies, and we're going to be refreshing that in the context of COVID-19 recovery and renewal. Thank you, Lynn.
Okay, and finally, we're going to have some welcome remarks by our third partner on this call, which is Bob Keefe from Environmental Entrepreneurs.
All right. Thank you, Lynn and Lisa, and thanks everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. As mentioned, I am Bob Keefe, Executive Director of E2. Next slide, please. If you don't know E2, we are a national network of business leaders, investors, and others who care about the economy and care about the environment and are willing to stand up and do something about it. Our members are individuals, not businesses, and we've got about 8,000 of them stretching across the country, across 9 chapters from New York and New England to Seattle and San Diego, where I happen to be joining you today. Our members include a lot of clean energy CEOs and execs and investors, but we also have members across a wide variety of other businesses as well. Together, they've founded or funded more than 2,500 companies, created about 600,000 jobs, and control about $100 billion in private and venture equity capital. Next slide, please. So the way we do that work is essentially 3 ways: through advocacy, direct and indirect, bringing our business voices to lawmakers in Washington and the states that we work in, also through communications work, and then lastly, and most pertinent to this discussion, is through research and reports. And one of the things that we've been doing quite diligently over the past almost a decade now, I guess, is tracking clean energy job growth and regrettably and more recently clean energy job declines in the past few months, which is what we're here to talk about today. And I look forward to chatting some more about that with our good friend Phil Jordan from BW Research a little later. And with that, Lynn, I'll turn it back to you.
So to kick off the discussion, we're going to start about a decade of growth that we've seen in the clean energy industry, and really the renewable energy, energy efficiency, and natural gas sectors, and the advanced energy technologies that are decarbonizing America have been the growth sectors of the U.S. energy economy over the past decade. So I just want to turn it quickly to Lisa to introduce the project that Ethan is going to be talking about today.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm very pleased to talk about the 2020 Sustainable Energy in America Factbook project. We launched this 8 years ago to understand what then were really burgeoning trends in U.S. energy markets. We look at, energy as a whole, but we drill down in particular in the power sector as well as transportation. And when we started this work, we could see that there were things that were happening that were going to be very transformative, and we were not sure if they were going to be systemic or just short-term shifts. But when we started to do the work, and clearly when we released the 2020 edition of the Factbook in February of this year, we could see some sustained and systemic changes that had been made. Now we find ourselves in this moment in time where, as I said before, energy use in all sectors of the economy may change in some new ways and unanticipated ways. So, we will be tracking that through the Factbook project in the years to come. But, for today, we're really pleased that the lead analytic firm and Ethan Zindler, head of Americas for BloombergNEF, is with us. And he's going to do 2 things. He's going to talk about the most recent findings from the Factbook, which did a 10-year look back on the changes in the U.S. energy marketplace. And he's also going to share some of the insights that BloombergNEF is finding as it relates to our current condition. So since the beginning, BloombergNEF has been the lead author for the Factbook, which, they produce it, and the BCSE commissions it each year with the support of members and other funders. It's all available for free. Most of the slides you're going to see today, you can access through the Factbook website. Also, there are videos and other digital tools and different ways to slice and dice the information. So I encourage you to look at the BCSE website, www.bcsc.org/Factbook, to get more information on what you're going to see presented today. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Ethan Zindler, head of Americas for BloombergNEF.
Wonderful. And I'm going to be transferring over the presenter privileges to you, Ethan, so get your slides ready. And I just wanted to comment that CEBN also offers a complimentary project to the Factbook called Faces Behind the Facts, profiling business leaders across the clean energy economy who are making these these transitions possible. And so if you're interested in participating in that project, I shared the link for where you can submit an application for consideration. So Ethan, now you should have presenter controls.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, and I'm fooling around with the presenter controls and trying to get it right. So give me 1 second for that. And as I do, first, of course, let me just say thanks to Lynn for hosting, and for Lisa, of course, just for supporting the project, and for Bob also for hosting me here today. It's a great opportunity. A lot to talk about, the title of my talk is 10 Years of Rapid Change and 3 years of Major Disruption, 3 months of major disruption. I think for many of us, the last 3 months have felt like 10 years, the amount of disruption we've seen has been really quite substantial, of course. Give me 1 more second, though, to try to get the slides right. And if not, I'm going to ask Lynn to jump in and save the day here. Then I assume you cannot see the slides yet. Is that correct? Lynn, are you still there?
We can see the slide deck, Ethan. You just need to maximize your slide by clicking on that.
Wonderful. Okay,
Yeah.
Hold on. Great. Can you see them now maximized? There we go.
Yeah, it's perfect now. Thank you.
Excellent. So as Lisa mentioned, I'm going to do 2 things. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about the Sustainable Energy in America fact book, which we worked on together last year and into the start of this year, which takes a look at the last 10 years of activity in clean energy in the U.S. And then I'm going to talk about the COVID-19 impacts that we've seen more recently. And then I think hopefully that's a good tee up for the rest of the conversation when we dig down even 1 level further to look at the jobs implications and what has been obviously a difficult time for the industry. So first, a bit of a level setting from the fact book last year. U.S. economy last year expanded by about 2.3%, which was the slowest pace since 2016. But one of the things that we do in the fact book every year is try to look at what we call energy productivity, which is just how effectively the U.S. economy makes use of energy. And you can see that GDP on an index basis has been growing since 1990, more or less, with the giant exception of the financial crisis. But primary energy consumption, which is that purple line, has not. And this is a fairly general trend we've seen actually in other developed countries. The U.S. has definitely been in line with that, which is that greater levels of energy efficiency each year allow us to be more productive in how we use energy in a variety of different ways, including homes and businesses, but also transportation. And on the right-hand side is simply if you divide the blue line by the purple line, you can see the sort of metric that we use of energy productivity and how that's been rising year by year. In particular, the report looks a lot at the impact on the power sector. And you can see here just how dramatic a change we've seen in coal and overall generation within the U.S. power sector. Renewables, which is the blue part at the top, you can see grew from about 11% of generation to 18%. That includes large hydro. Coal basically halved to 23%, and we anticipate this year could very well be under 20%. We've already seen months with much lower production levels than that. And then, of course, the other big story has been natural gas, and it grew by more than half to get to 38% and the largest overall share of generation. And you can see on the right-hand side that just without going into great detail, but if you look at this on an absolute basis, that basically overall top-line electricity demand, as I mentioned earlier, has been pretty much flat over the last decade or so. Of course, there's different stories by different regions. PJM, an enormous power market as big as, or bigger than the number of European nations, has been, which you see in the heart of the country, has fairly been similar to what we've seen elsewhere in terms of the reduction of coal, though with a higher proportion of nuclear. In the Northwest, hydro continues to be predominant. The Southeast, the coal numbers you can see have been tailing off as well. Different stories in different regions. that all add up to make the overall picture that I showed a moment ago. One of the main reasons why renewables have been growing has simply been because they are the lowest cost provider of electricity on a new build basis. That is, when you go to look to add a megawatt of new capacity, what's going to be your cheapest source of generation? And on the left-hand side is just a look from our latest levelized cost of electricity analysis. We broke it down by ISOs around the country, and apologies for those of you who know. Obviously, these lines don't exactly map the ISO lines, but they do more or less. And you can see in different regions, different technologies are sort of the king in terms of being the lowest cost. Obviously, there's variations within the regions, but nonetheless, we point out that on an unsubsidized basis, solar is now the cheapest source of generation in the Southwest and in parts of the Northeast. For different reasons. You have really good resources in terms of sun in the Southwest, very high power prices by comparison in the Northeast. Through the center of the country is the so-called wind corridor, where you can see how cheap wind is. And again, this is not including the impact of the ITC and the PTC. However, if you do include those impacts, basically everywhere in the country right now, renewables are the lowest cost option, beating out even gas, thanks to the $24 per megawatt hour PTC or the 30% ITC that's still available. And thus, you can see why it remains important to the industry in the short run. In terms of new build, the United States really hasn't built a coal plant now, coming up on about 7 or 8 years. Most of the build that we continue to see is renewables and gas, a tiny bit of nuclear, one plant in 2016 and another one in theory coming sometime in the next 5 years or so. But generally speaking, we build gas, we build renewables in the US now, and that's not likely, at least in my opinion, to change. That's not a fact, that's an opinion, but this seems very unlikely that we'll go back to building any new coal in the US. I'm not going to dwell on this just in the interest of time, other than to say that basically the level of coal retirements and announced coal retirements that we saw into last year and now actually into this year have not slowed in any kind of way, and if anything have accelerated under the Trump administration, as a lot of the economics of those plants are not viable at the moment. One thing we also talked about in the fact book was the role of corporate power purchase agreements. That's bilateral contracts between big companies and providers of wind and solar. This actually, I just updated this to include where we are through the first quarter of this year. But last year we saw a record volume of build in the US with 13.5 gigawatts, driven by the desire to serve corporate customers who wanted access to renewable power, which was by far a record. Overall, through the end of the first quarter, we're at about 36 gigawatts of such projects online in the United States. And this continues to play an important role as we look to the future with companies, A, wanting to sign contracts that are low priced and fixed, and B, in a number of cases, having made clean energy or other science-based type goals to reduce their CO2 emissions. This is just a look at the companies that have been the leaders through the first quarter of this year, sort of an interesting list. We've certainly seen telecom and tech companies on here before, but a few other interesting names. This is a global number, by the way, a global list. So there's some, these contracts were not signed in the US, but nonetheless, it's an interesting hodgepodge of companies, and in the case of University of Pennsylvania, an NGO. One thing I always want to emphasize when we talk about the broader picture, especially in the Washington context, is that all this change has been achieved, and really a massive transformation of the power sector in particular, without any boost to consumer spending on energy. The left-hand chart is just a very quick look at what consumers are spending on a monthly basis, their total spend versus their total overall consumption expenditures. So very low, about 4% of all spend. And on the right-hand side, you see electricity and gas broken out. We don't have gasoline on here, but similar story, very, very low. And of course, It's been helped by low fossil prices for natural gas, for gasoline, but of course, renewables have played a role as well. I'll talk more about COVID in a second, but I'll be very intrigued to see what these charts look like for 2020, given how low gasoline prices have gotten at certain points and the effect that we've seen on power prices as well. Unclear to me on the power price side how much of it's gotten through the retail customers. And then, of course, there's the other question, which is, maybe consumers are going to be reducing their overall household spending, and energy thus might actually rise because the overall pie of spending might go down this year. Real quick on emissions, basically the U.S. is more or less halfway towards the goal of meeting what would have been the Paris target of cutting CO2 emissions by 26 to 28% by the middle of this decade. Of course, the Trump administration has now signaled that they plan to abandon that commitment overall. I think one thing, though, that's worth noting is what's going on the right-hand side here, where you see that power sector emissions, as of a couple of years ago, are no longer the number one source of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions in the U.S. And last year, rather amazingly, they dropped 2.7% year on year from 2018 to 2019. So a sharp reduction, and the transportation sector is definitely one now that is a major contributor, and one, especially in light of the discussion around CAFE standards, which is worthy of focusing on going forward. All right, so let's talk about what's going on with COVID, which I know is enormously relevant to a lot of folks, hopefully on this call. And I think, I'll just preface this by stating the obvious, which is that this is an incredibly uncertain time. And as we think about the kind of forecasting that we do, one of the challenges that we have is that we are not epidemiologists, we are not macroeconomic experts, we are energy focused folks. And so the best we can do is try and take guidance from whatever kind of projections that we see of how the overall economy is going to perform as we look forward. And I think one of the challenges for us is that it does seem like a lot of people are of the view that this is going to be sort of a V-shaped situation where we have a very sharp drop in economic activity followed by a bounce back. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I would say that it is sort of somewhat the model on which we have sought to make at least our short-term forecasts. That said, we will definitely continue to revise them and massage them as we get further along. But just one caveat always worth noting before talking about sort of the outlook for the future, given the massive uncertainties. But before even getting into that, let's talk a little bit about what we've seen. One of the things we've done for our clients is to build a tool to track electricity demand really up to the day. And I just said it just yesterday to look back over the last 7 weeks, which more or less takes us back to the start of April. And you can see that for the so-called lower 48, which is basically the whole U.S. ex Hawaii and Alaska, we've seen electricity demand down by about 6% across the country. Below the surface, I have no doubt what's gone on here is that residential demand has actually gone up, while commercial industrial demand has gone down. And those two things don't entirely offset each other, but it has resulted in a substantial but not massive differential in electricity consumption between where we would have been. And I would note that what this chart depicts is a comparison versus business as usual. And I guess I would just point that out in the context of the fact that just simply comparing to what electricity demand was, say, last year or the year before doesn't really work because the spring and fall seasons, the shoulder seasons, are very unpredictable in terms of electricity demand, and you really need to do a little math to try and make some assumptions about what a single day would have looked like based on the weather patterns of that day, or based on whether that day is a weekday or a weekend day. And we've done that to try and put together a BAU and then look at comparisons here. Before moving off this slide, just a couple other quick things. It's certainly notable that New York City in particular saw such a sharp decline. I really can only theorize about why that is. Quite possibly people leaving the city. I do know a number of people who could get out of New York did. The same may be true of LA. It's fascinating to see the number for the Southern Company region of the Southeast as well, down 13%. But there's real variation, and it depends on which region you're talking about. If you look at the whole U.S., though, compared to prior years, you can see that we are certainly tracking below where we've been at about 350, maybe 360 gigawatts of demand on an average day over the last couple of months, compared to numbers that are typically closer to about 400 overall. I always think it's important when talking about what we've seen on COVID with electricity to talk for a moment about what we're seeing in other areas of the energy world, because the decline in demand for fossil fuels on transportation has been really dramatic. And this is just a look at here of how much gasoline consumption has cratered in the last 2 months as the country has, in many states or most states, gone into lockdown. You can also, though, see how it's rebounding now as states start to gradually, quote unquote, open up. To talk a little bit now here about the clean energy sector, specifically renewables, and the impact that we've seen on COVID. One of the challenges that we have at BNEF is to just try and stay across all the developments. And so to some degree, it's anecdotal what we're hearing now about what's going on in the supply chain. But I do think it's worth noting that COVID-19 is not just something that's affecting the renewable energy industry in terms of the regulations and the laws of where these plants are operating, either power plants or manufacturing plants, but literally in terms of people being affected within the plant. So this is just one update from Grand Forks, from LM Wind Power, a manufacturing plant. This is SunPower, which has been idling factories, in some cases having folks work on reduced pay, both in the US and other parts around the world. And TPI, which makes blades, has had issues with manufacturing plants in Mexico and the US, where either workers don't want to work or there's been issues around health. These headlines are all a month old, frankly, and I'm sure there's been updates since then. But nonetheless, we are seeing this impact. And it is global. We looked around the world with all our analysts, really reaching out to try and get a sense as to what was going on with the supply chains. And first, on the left-hand side, we just looked to see whether construction was continuing. In most cases, we see yellow, meaning, yes, it's continuing, but with disruptions. In some cases, red, where it's been completely stopped, in the case of Spain and India. The center column just looks at whether factories are open, and you can see that in most cases, yes is the answer, but with disruptions again, and a few more places where the factories are not operating at all. And then finally, the right-hand side looks at auctions, which is not as big an issue for us in the US, but globally is a major issue, because that's how a lot of renewable energy capacity gets built through bilateral contracts between developers and governments. Back on the U.S. for a second, I had our team actually just update this data this morning, and this is just a look at weekly solar rooftop permits that are issued. And thanks to Ohm Analytics, this is their data that we pull and use here. And you can see if you just basically index them to the start of the year, the numbers are down. Now, one would presumably assume at this time of year they would be rising due to warmer weather. I'm not quite sure what's going on in Colorado, that it's gone to just flat zero. Probably have to look a little bit into that. But you can see overall by market, the residential market the solar rooftop market is down. I think we'll probably hear more from VW on that, because this is a part of the clean energy sector that's very labor intensive. And so this may explain some of the numbers that we're going to hear a little bit more about later. As I mentioned, auctions are really important. I won't go through this too much because it's not as relevant to the US, but we're seeing an enormous number of projects where the auctions are being delayed. That doesn't necessarily hurt the build numbers for this year on its own, but will potentially into the future. I think it'd be worth just for a moment saying a quick thing about overall build numbers and the size of the overall clean energy market for this year, especially since the IEA put out their report this morning saying that they thought that renewable numbers would be down a bit this year in terms of new build. We've sort of been saying the same thing for a month, but the IEA, it's like hearing from the voice of God. So the media covered that a lot today. But overall, we've been of the view for about over a month now that basically, that for 2020 on the solar side globally, you'll see total bill be anywhere from 6 to 11% lower than we would have anticipated, with a potential decline, but not a definite decline for this year, but a potential decline from 114 gigawatts in 2019 to 108. With solar, it's a very squirrely business of doing forecasting, and you can see that we always have a high and low estimate for any given year. But there is a very reasonable possibility, likelihood even, that we'll see a solar decline for this year. Wind, same thing. We've cut our forecast for 2020. You can see here by about 12% globally. But basically, we bumped the numbers up in the following years on the assumption that a lot of projects that don't get built this year will get built in future years. And this is just based on the assumption that this stuff is cost competitive and will continue to be so going forward. I'm going to try and accelerate through the end here so we can give everybody more time. But just, but overall, I did want to just share that our number for this year is, we're looking at somewhere around 22, 23 gigawatts. 22, 23 gigawatts of total renewable build in the U.S. this year, split about 50-50 between wind and solar. I would just note that our number has been more conservative than actually. Interestingly enough, the EIA this year, and I think some others as well. So our reductions in numbers haven't necessarily been as dramatic because we came in with a fairly measured number to begin with. But we do expect a big bounce back, particularly for solar next year. Again, on the assumption that this is short-lived, relatively speaking, and a lot of things get pushed into next year. We'll continue to revisit that, though, because like I said at the start of this section, it's a big assumption to assume that this is going to be a short-lived setback. Again, not for just renewables, but for the entire world economy. I'm going to finish off just by talking a little bit about electric vehicles because just yesterday we released our long-term view on EVs, and I did want to just touch on it for just a second. Again, like with renewables, we do think it's likely that this year you will see less EVs sold than the record 2.1 million that were sold last year, with about maybe 3/4 of those being battery electric as opposed to plug-in electric in both years. But we do think the market will come back 2021, 2022, and 2023. And one important thing just to note here is that overall car sales this year are going to be down. And we think overall car sales are going to be down more than EV car sales will be on a percentage basis. If you look by region, you can see here, the U.S. is an important, but by no means the largest market for electric vehicle demand. And we think the market does shrink a bit, that 0.3 million to about 0.2 year on year, 2019 to 2020. And it is also worth noting that, that China and Europe, we think, will continue to pull further ahead of the U.S. as an EV market, for a variety of reasons, but maybe but really the biggest one being policy support that we are seeing in China, and the new version of the European Union potential stimulus also looks like it will have further support for electric vehicles. We are not seeing that same kind of federal policy support here in the U.S. And then I'm going to finish, almost finish here, with just the long run view, which is, ultimately we do think that, that you get to about 58% of electric vehicles of total sales by 2040. It is worth noting that, we're of the view that total car sales will peak in the 2030s and that will be due to saturation and lack of available new markets. But even if this all comes to pass, you can still see that you'd only have about a third of the cars on the road by 2040 be electric vehicles. I'm not going to walk through this just in the interest of time, but just to say that we are at BNEF carefully tracking policy responses to the pandemic around the world as far as how energy and sustainability issues are being included. And, you can see we've got a red, yellow, a green, mock-up here and nothing green up on the top. And that's because to date, we have not seen implemented any major clean energy stimulus measures, although we do think they're in the works, potentially in Europe and China. And in the U.S., I think this is more, again, personal opinion here, but we're not very bullish on the potential at this point, given what we've seen out of Congress and the administration. So with that, hopefully that's a useful level setting for us to talk further about jobs. And let me hand it back to you, Lynn.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that really detailed and insightful overview, Ethan. And I'm going to change the presenting back to Andy. We're just going to give him a moment to share his slides as well. Okay, we are ready to go again. And so thank you so much, Ethan, again. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Phil Jordan from BW Research and Bob Keefe from the Environmental Entrepreneurs. And I think Phil is going to kick off the discussion here.
Hey, thanks. Thanks, everybody, and appreciate you being here today. I'm just going to very briefly sort of touch on a few highlights here to set some context, and then turn it over to Bob Keefe to talk about some specifics around clean energy and the impacts. Just really to level set things. Hopefully, you can see the line here all the way to the right above the 2020 number on COVID-19. This is such a dramatic number of job losses over such a short period of time that you almost can't see prior recessions in the chart. You can see in 2009 a little blip in comparison to what we're dealing with today. And so what we're really seeing are historical job losses that are really sort of hard to fathom. So the record before March of this year was 700,000 initial claims in a week. And we're averaging about 5 million a week over the last 7 weeks. So it's a truly remarkable job loss. Phase 1 in March was really largely about leisure and hospitality losses. So we saw lots of losses as expected in restaurants and retail, hotels, etc. But phase 2 really much more broadly and impacting a lot more of the clusters and specifically really starting to see some significant impacts in clean energy. So why don't I turn over to Bob, who can discuss some more of the good news and the more recent bad news about the clean energy employment landscape.
Yes, thanks, Phil, and thanks, everybody. Let's go a little deeper into clean energy, the stuff that a lot of us are on the call to talk about today. So this chart is from our National Clean Jobs America report that we released thanks to BW's great research capabilities about a month ago. This is based on the U.S. Energy Employment report that comes out from NASIO and EFI every year that we have helped support for a number of years. We've been tracking clean energy jobs at E2, as I mentioned, for almost a decade now. At the end of last year, as we all know, this was an industry that was on a solid growth trajectory, outpacing the rest of the economy, growing by about more than 10%. Compared to the national employment increases of about 6%. About 3.4 million Americans worked in clean energy at the end of last year. And you can see the breakdown there. The biggest bulk is around energy efficiency, not surprisingly, but we also track those other categories you'll see there on the left. Next slide, please. These jobs are really across a wide swath of occupations and different parts of our economy, which in our opinion, and probably yours too, underscores the importance of clean energy in an economic recovery. We're talking about construction, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about agriculture in terms of clean fuels, and of course, renewables and other categories as well. Next slide, please. So that's, and by the way, these are jobs in every state, as we all know on this call anyway. Yes, California leads, but if you look at the top 10, we're also talking about North Carolina, number 2 solar state in the country, in part because it's got the only renewable portfolio standard in the Southeast. Massachusetts, obviously, high on the top 10 because of its great energy efficiency standards in that state. And you'll see clean energy, obviously, is, as we know, not blue states, not coastal states, red states, blue states, purple states, and every other state in between. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. Well, the next slide is going to show that that's the good news, and that gives you some size and scope of the clean energy industry. And then the wheels fell off, as we know, in March and April due to the COVID-19 crisis. Phil gave you the overview of what it did to the economy generally. We asked Phil and BW to go back and look at the unemployment filings for March and April to put some, using the criteria that we use for Clean Jobs America and for the user report. And this is what we found. Nearly 600,000 Americans that work in clean energy lost their jobs in March and April alone. Again, energy efficiency led in the job losses. We know this is directly related to EE workers not being able to get into buildings, office buildings, homes, et cetera, to do their jobs. Renewable energy saw a pretty major decline for a couple of reasons. Among other things, the uncertainty around financing and the economy in general. But as our members have told us, they also have problems getting solar panels because they're tied up in factories overseas and domestically, and wind turbine parts, et cetera. Other parts of both the energy efficiency and some of these other sectors were hard hit because of factory closings. We track, as part of our energy efficiency work, we track manufacturing of everything from insulation and low E windows to Energy Star appliances and LED lighting systems to other building products that serve the energy efficiency market. So that took a big hit as well. And as Phil projects and BW projects, this unfortunately will probably get worse before it gets better. We're now predicting about 850,000 job losses through the end of next month, through the end of the second quarter. Next slide, please. What we see here is that, again, just like the industry is spread across every state is impacted. One of the interesting things I saw in the April data, for instance, is that, yes, of course, California, again, leads the country in job losses in clean energy, but some of the biggest losses were in red states in the Southeast, for instance, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina. One of the biggest percentage declines in clean energy job numbers was in the state of Kentucky. And I think maybe Phil can get into some of the reasons behind that in a minute. And I'd like to take a pause and just turn it back over to Phil to see if he's got anything to add, since he's the mastermind behind the methodology and tracking this data.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Appreciate that. And I would just note a couple of quick things here. We've gotten accustomed, Bob, over the years to releasing a lot of good news, as you'd suggested, and it's sometimes difficult to be the bearer of bad news, but we think it is really important because it does show that these impacts are really hurting people all across the country and across a lot of different sectors. We've seen a lot of declines in manufacturing and construction through April, which are obviously key components of the clean energy economy. In fact, those two categories make up the majority of those clean energy jobs. We think, though, there is some reason for hope going forward. There is a lot of talk in Congress so far, just talk about a stimulus that moves beyond disaster relief, which is what we've seen to date, and moves towards actual stimulus of infrastructure and other projects. We think that given that there's a path that comes back to some sort of new normal that includes at least three phases, right, with the lockdown phase, the recovery phase, and then a post-vaccine phase. We think clean energy can play a very, very important role in that recovery phase. These are jobs that can be performed either in vacant or underutilized buildings, outside, using personal protective equipment, and maintaining physical distancing. The skilled workforce exists. It's ready to go. A lot of the people who are a lot of the people who are at home now, either supported through programs like PPP or unemployment insurance, have the skills and ability and desire to get back out into the workplace, and there are ways that we can do that safely. So I know, Bob, you had quite a few ideas that you have been promoting through a variety of vehicles and your work on the Hill. But I do think that it is important for us to recognize, as we look at these losses, that that it also creates a real opportunity to get people back to work. That those jobs be felt in hard-hit sectors in construction and manufacturing, and in states like Kentucky and Pennsylvania and Florida and Texas that are seeing some pretty steep declines, and where the folks could use some help. We know that the jobs respond well to stimulus. They've responded well to stimulus in the past. And while we don't have the slide up currently that shows the scale of job losses, we're now in a place that is much closer to the Great Depression than the Great Recession in terms of job losses. And our hope is that policymakers will respond commensurately. So, Bob, I don't know if I turn it back to you, and you can talk about your Repowering America plan, and then we can maybe start to wrap things up.
Well, I'll just say real quick that thank you, Phil. As we know, again, clean energy is a great catalyst, perhaps the best catalyst to get America back to work again. We know this from what happened after the Great Recession, in which we invested $90 billion into clean energy through the ARA stimulus, and the output was hundreds of thousands of jobs, projects, weatherization, et cetera. We also know that clean energy is the perfect catalyst to get as many people back to work in as many places across as many occupations as possible. So that's the types of things that, and of course, it builds a great foundation to continue the growth of a cleaner, more resilient, more secure economy as we continue to recover from this devastating crisis. So happy to talk a little bit more about that, but would love to turn it back over to Lynn to the time constraints.
Wonderful, thank you. Really appreciate those insights from Bob and Phil. And I also want to just give kudos to Phil for his partnership with Natixis Investment Managers, which is another partner of ours that is offering sustainable 401k, term limited 401k offerings that are screened for environmental, social, and governance benefits. And Phil has worked on a really exciting new survey with Natixis. I don't know, Phil, if you just want to mention that really quickly before we wrap things up.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. So yes, we're really excited about this work, and we're going to be sort of updating some of these findings to show what is critical in this time of post-COVID world. But the Natixis Future of Work survey looked at a variety of factors across the America's workplaces, and the reason why we think it's particularly relevant is while the data were collected prior to the COVID crisis, what we're seeing in a lot of the data now is that trends that were sort of in existence before are really accelerating now. So the focus of the Future of Work survey was looking at some trends in the workplace, including job volatility and what workers are looking for. And I would just sort of throw out there that one of the key findings is that many employees, especially highly skilled employees in a competitive environment, we're really looking for a lot of things beyond wages, and really looking for companies that share their sort of values and worldview, and that companies that were able to communicate that to their employees really were faring much better. One of the key elements that we dug into was ESG funds and the environment and social governance, and what we found is that these funds that are focused on sustainability can be very, very attractive to particularly younger workers and high-skilled workers. And we think that actually, if you review these findings now and look at them in the light of the COVID-19 crisis, you can see that a lot of the trends that were projected to likely be coming true have really rapidly sort of come to pass. So we encourage you to take a look at that work, and we're very excited about it.
Wonderful. And finally, I want to flag that despite all the recent challenges that we've heard about, there are some clean energy companies and organizations that are in fact hiring. And we are very excited at the Clean Energy Business Network to announce Clean Energy Social as our newest premium member and partner, and wanted to highlight some of the resources that they have available for folks that are looking for their next hire or their next job right now. So I've listed their website, and this organization is powering the Clean Energy Professional Network, offering resources to research companies, apply for jobs, find education and training opportunities, and network with other professionals. And we see them as being very complementary to our mission in terms of the types of resources they have to offer. So definitely check them out if you're hiring or looking for employment right now. And at this point, we want to open it up to questions and discussion with our panelists in the few minutes that we have remaining. And I have noted that if you have any questions, you can feel free to send them in the chat box to the host. And just to kick it off, one question for Bob and Phil. I don't know if you have analyzed this or seen some sort of comparison, but do you have any sense of how the job losses we've seen in the clean energy industry compare to other energy industries?
I can take a piece of that, and then Phil can correct me where I'm wrong. But in a nutshell, clean energy employment has been hit harder than other sectors of the energy economy. If you look at the April data, clean energy jobs are down about 17%. The overall energy sector employment fell about 12% in April. Coal jobs fell by 10%. Now, why is that? It's mainly because of the nature of the business, we think. Energy efficiency workers, as mentioned, are not able to get into buildings, into homes, et cetera, to do their jobs. That's a huge part of the clean energy sector, of course. And energy efficiency workers, in many cases, most cases probably, along with other clean energy occupations, were not considered, quote unquote, essential businesses by many states. Whereas oil field workers, for instance, can still get out there and get on the job, and coal miners as well, I assume.
Yeah, this is Phil. That's exactly right, Bob. And I would just add that when we think about what a response could be to getting the jobs back, there's not much that's some sort of stimulus or policy intervention at this point can do to bring back, say, oil jobs as an example in the near term, right? The reason why oil prices didn't go negative yesterday is because demand has been cut, right? And I'm sorry, supply has been cut, huge supply cuts, and we know that demand is down. So in order to clear that and come back to positive job growth in the oil sector, for example, not only do you need demand to rebound, you also need to clear the existing glut and then start drilling oil again. That's a long process, and it's very hard to see how stimulus and policy intervention can create the kind of job gains that we need to get people back to work quickly. So again, back to the sort of policy response question, clean energy has been hit harder and certainly would respond much more quickly to stimulus because of the nature of activities.
Great. And Ethan, I know you've talked a bit about in just our conversations preparing for this about how you've seen that this crisis is sort of accelerating the decline of industries that were already on the decline. And so I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that comment just regarding, which industries will rebound in response to stimulus.
Well, good question. I mean, I would say this, that if we are in a period of prolonged lower electricity demand, it will sort of, I think, will accelerate the longer term trend that we've already seen, which is the retirement of uneconomic coal plants. And that trend, we think, will continue over the next 10 years would have continued regardless of COVID, but it will get accelerated if we continue to live in a world where electricity demand is anywhere from 5 to 10% below what it would ordinarily be. It simply, someone simply loses out in that scenario where the pie shrinks. And if you're at the sort of high end of the stack, then you're the ones who are going to get left out. So it's not surprising to me that we continue to hear coal plant retirements, and this, it really depends on how long that will, go on. On transportation, it's a harder call. I think we've tried to say that we think that electric vehicles still get to a point where they are viable without subsidies by the middle of this decade. We don't think, that oil priced at, under $20 a barrel, or I guess now it's up over 30, but we don't think a very, very low oil price is sustainable in the long run. The market, I think as Phil pointed out, does sort of rebalance in its own way by just reducing production. So that does help electric vehicle economics longer term.
That's helpful. And kind of pivoting off of that, for Lisa, I'm curious to know what you hear from the companies and utilities in your membership in terms of how this is changing how they do business. There's a lot that, all of our speakers have highlighted some of the news clips. We've read a lot about changes in utility demand and how that's shifting from more commercial and industrial sector to residential. But I'm also curious if you've heard any differences in terms of projects, the types of projects that are able to continue going forward right now versus work that's been put on hold.
Well, I really agree with a lot of the comments that already have been made, and that there's different different sectors within our membership that are impacted in different ways, especially depending on local ordinances and whether they're considered an essential essential project, essential infrastructure project, or if their workers are considered essential workers. And for much of the BCSE membership on the commercial utility scale side, that's the way they've been classified. However, sometimes their supply chains don't have a similar classification, and that's caused problems, and it will continue to if this is a prolonged recovery. But I think one of the areas where I've seen a great deal of thought relates to the future of buildings and what that means for companies on mostly the commercial building side. In this case, with schools, hospitals, government buildings of other types are empty for periods of time. Can we use this opportunity over the next 6 to 18 months to do retrofits to make those buildings more resilient, more flexible, more adaptable? And, there's been some pretty sophisticated thought about what we can be doing in the short term, but also longer term, really, what is the use and utilization of buildings? And it relates to the future of work and the future of transportation too, of course, but I've heard a lot of conversations about how do we use this time to increase the resilience of critical buildings and facilities.
That's really helpful. And I find that, hopefully that we can take that as the silver lining of this crisis is that, it just exposes some of the challenges that we face in our energy infrastructure and the need to build more resilient infrastructure. And I would just kind of building upon your comments on what you're hearing in terms of employees being considered essential and some of the disruptions. We hear slightly different things from smaller businesses that I think, we've been actually doing a survey, which I would urge we'll circulate it in the follow-up materials I would really urge folks to consider participating in this to tell us more about specifically how you are being impacted. It's not to it's a supplement to the type of work that Phil and Bob are doing, in the sense we're trying to get into the nitty gritty of particular changes employers are making, and then what types of policies will be most helpful in getting folks back to work after this crisis. So please, I urge you to take that. But from what we've seen so far, about 17% of the respondents that we've gotten so far have been either laying people off or furloughing. And the majority, actually, I think all of those have been smaller companies that in terms of our own respondents. And so that is one thing that does concern me is just, small businesses in particular are more vulnerable to disruption and have less padding, frankly, in their, revenues to weather crises like this. So one of the things we're trying to do to support businesses that are having a difficult time right now is we have opened up the Clean Energy Business Network's funding database, which is an aggregation of various private, federal, and state funding resources for free to the public right now. So if you visit our website, you can check that out. And I have, hopefully some of the resources that will circulate to participants on this call will be helpful to those who are on the line. And then one final question, and then we'll let all of our panelists go. We have a question regarding the increase in solar and wind projects and some of the resulting factors that might cause strain on electric curtailment, stranded supply, and grid congestion. Can you talk at all about future opportunities with power to gas projects as an avenue to help relieve the magnitude of some of these challenges? So this might be, I don't know, Ethan, perhaps you're best poised to talk a little bit about how power to gas might help with stranded renewable assets.
I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but I think if the question is about using sort of renewables that are generating capacity beyond what's required, rather than curtailing them, using them to generate hydrogen potentially, that's something that's out there and something we've probably looked a lot at. But given the very, very low costs of renewable generation is something that's been examined. There's also talk of using nuclear power to generate hydrogen. But I would say this: we're a long way from that really being viable. Not because, frankly, renewable generation is too expensive, but because the cost of a hydrolyzer is just too high for that kind of thing. And while prices are definitely cheaper in different parts of the world, and we think will come down, we're definitely not there yet by any means. Overall, though, I mean, it still raises one important point, which is that if you have lower overall demand, then you have renewables playing a larger role in the system on a percentage basis than they were, because they are the first to be dispatched. But I don't necessarily regard that as meaning that they're going to be at a lot higher levels of curtailment for them. I think they're just going to be at a higher percentage. And then somewhat related but unrelated point is that if you have renewables starting to achieve higher percentages of overall generation, that has interesting policy implications, only because a lot of state renewable portfolio standards are written in a way so that the milestones are based on what percentage of total generation or consumption is clean. And renewables are, certainly this year seeing that number way up, but not necessarily because of added capacity, but partially because of just total demand being down. So there, again, big ifs, but if we're in a world where we have prolonged lower demand for electricity, then RPSs will probably need to be, I would say, at least re-examined in that context.
Great. Well, we are over time, and I really appreciate the enormous interest in participants in joining this conversation today. We've provided the contact information for all of the panelists so that in case you have any questions and want to follow up with them. Really appreciate the insights and the time of our panelists today. I think this was a very, very interesting conversation. And before we close it up, just wanted to see if any of our panelists had any further comments that they would like to conclude with before we wrap this up. Okay, well, hearing none, thank you so much for joining us, and we will be circulating the slides and recording as soon as they are available. Take care, everyone. Thank you.